We're going to begin. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this literary celebration with Liana Cusmano and Vincenzo Pietropaolo. I'm Liana Cusmano, and it's a pleasure to be here with Vincenzo, and we want to thank you all for coming. This event is funded by the Canada Council for the Arts through the Writers' Union of Canada and with the support of Accenti magazine. We're here to celebrate as it sort of winds up and comes to a close, Pride Month and Italian Heritage Month with some writing that Vince and I have done. But before we get into all of that, I want to respectfully acknowledge the land on which we live and work. All of us in Canada and on Turtle Island has been a site of human activity for 15,000 years. The land where Vincenzo is located, Toronto, is the territory of the Huron-Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. Today, the meeting place of Toronto is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island. I'm located in Jojaga, Montreal. It is the traditional territory of the Ganyankahaga, a place which has long served as a site of meeting and exchange among many First Nations, including the Ganyankahaga of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, the Huron-Wendat, the Abenaki, and the Anishinaabe. We're mindful of broken covenants and of the need to strive to make right with all of our relations. And we want to encourage all of you to, if you don't know what Indigenous land you're on, do some research about it. And to think about it a little bit further, because it's gotten, I find, increasingly easy to just rattle off land acknowledgements at the beginning of events, which is something the land acknowledgements need to be made, but they should be made mindfully, and all of us should have a better idea as to where we are and who came before, so that that process continues, that reconciliation and decolonization process continues. So I want to introduce Vincenzo Pietropaolo. It's a pleasure to be here and to have this event with you. He was born in Italy, but grew up in Toronto. He's a photographer, writer, and independent researcher with a particular interest in social justice issues. He's a distinguished bookmaker, having published over a dozen volumes, frequently combining his photography with his own original writing. His photography has been exhibited across Canada and internationally, and are included in the collections of the National Gallery of Canada, the AGO, the Canadian Museum for Human Rights, and RIC at Metropolitan Toronto University. His writing has appeared in numerous magazines, journals, and books, including Descant and People, Places, Passages. His next book, Toronto's Community, 50 Years of Photography, will be published in May 2023. He is a member of the Writers' Union of Canada. Vince, it's such a pleasure for me to share the virtual stage with you at this event.
Thank you. Thank you, Liana. It's really my great pleasure to be reading because I have something that I don't usually do. So I'm honored to be a part of this event today. And now I will introduce Liana. Born and raised in Montreal, Liana Cusmano is a writer, filmmaker, spoken word artist, and arts educator who works in English, French, and Italian. Liana recently published their first novel, Catch and Release, by Guernica Press. Their work explores cultural heritage, sexual orientation, and gender identity, queerness, interpersonal relationships, physical and mental health. A graduate of McGill University, Liana is the 2018 and 2019 Montreal Slam Champion, runner-up in the 2019 Canadian Individual Poetry Slam Championship, and a participant in the 2019 Spoken Word Residency Program at the Banff Center for Arts and Creativity. Liana Cusmano wrote and directed the film Matters of Great Unimportance, and also the film script for La Femme Fatale, La Femme Finale, screened at the Cannes Film Festival. Liana is editor-at-large also at Accenti magazine. And with that, I'll invite Liana to start reading, and then I'll follow her reading.
Thanks very much. The slip of Femme Fatale is especially appropriate because the title is a play on Femme Fatale. I'm going to be reading an excerpt from my debut novel, Catch and Release, and I'll read a poem for all of you as well. I think it's especially appropriate to be reading an excerpt from the book because it just came out, but also because I just got back from visiting my partner's family in Ontario. So as a queer Italian Canadian who's meeting their partner's family, that was a big deal. And it was something that my partner and I had talked about and discussed many times. And it was lovely. It was really wonderful. And my partner's mother had read the book, which I thought was also very kind. And such a milestone in a queer person's life. I think that Pride Month is something that, so many of us have heard, and we sort of vaguely talk about how corporate it is. But it's so important to really dig deep and think about, okay, what does this mean for queer people? And what are some of the milestones for queer people that we want to celebrate and that we want to underline? Relationships with partners' families, with our own families, all of that is really important. So I'm going to start with a chapter in the book where the protagonist decides that she's going to receive treatment for her various the symptoms that indicate a worsening of her mental health. And she's resisted this for a long time. And so this chapter really deals with that final acceptance of having to go see a professional when you have a problem. Before my first several sessions at the sexual identity clinic, I sat for 25 minutes in an entryway with cluttered corkboards and sickly yellow walls, waiting to be called in. Every time, my anxiety threatened to choke all the air out of my body as I sat there, almost 30 minutes early for every session. My appointments were always at 9 in the morning on Tuesdays because I only started class at 11:30, but my day was usually shot after that. The best way I can describe my first therapy sessions is to compare them to throwing up when you have gastro. You feel really empty and drained and a little better, but you know you're definitely still sick. Sitting in my chair in that entryway on a cushion that was an ugly shade of orange, I thought about walking out of the clinic every single time. My hands were sweaty. I could feel my heart pounding. I think it might have been the 5th session when Dr. Franklin asked me about my anxiety in relation to the clinic itself. Are you anxious right now? I smirked. She left the office and returned a few seconds later with a heart rate monitor. It looked like it hadn't seen the light of day since the 1980s, and just the sight of it made me nervous. She pulled up my sleeve and wrapped the band around my forearm and fixed the clip onto my finger. My resting heart rate was apparently 100 beats per minute. I was either suffering from a heart condition or constantly jogging. Close your eyes, Dr. Franklin said, removing the contraption and freeing up my arm. Take a few deep breaths. Take your time. I did. A few minutes later, when she asked me whether I felt calmer, I said yes. She took my heart rate again, and when I opened my eyes, I could see that it had shot up to 120 beats per minute. We concluded that I wasn't too fond of the heart rate monitor, and Dr. Franklin scuttled it back into its dusty pre-21st century holding cell. A half hour later, we checked my heart rate again by counting my pulse for 10 seconds and then multiplying by 6, something I'd done many times with my team at soccer practice. This time, in the absence of a dusty old contraption that triggered my fear of the unknown and uncontrollable, my heart rate was a normal 62 beats per minute, and of how good it felt to be completely unself-conscious, how calm I could feel if I managed to be totally outside of my own head. I had always been able to use sleep, study, or soccer to do that, but now without alcohol, the only recourse I felt I had left was, ironically, to try being acutely aware of myself in a psychiatrist's office for a whole hour at a time, so that maybe by examining all the different parts of myself, I could eventually learn to keep them from suffocating me from the inside. My initial impression of Dr. Franklin when I met her that first session in November was that she was really good with people, which makes sense, and I felt comfortable with her right away. She called me into her office, and instead of turning around to walk straight out of the clinic, I shuffled to her door, stepped into the room, and waited for her motion before I sat down in a bright red sofa chair, which was closer to the ground than it looked, and that made it feel like I'd missed a step going up the stairs, but with my behind. The chair was right beside a large desk, which was covered in Post-it notes and books and files and pens and papers. The desk and the sofa chair were arranged side by side in such a way that their occupants would face one another. Behind the desk was an enormous filing cabinet, which filled up another corner of the small room. Across from the cabinet was the door in the third corner, and the last corner was home to a huge bookshelf full of textbooks and binders. The wall across from me was papered with diplomas and photos and drawings and flyers and all kinds of other things. The office wasn't cluttered, but its small size made it seem fuller than it was. My favorite thing in it was a tiny cactus on the windowsill by the filing cabinet right across from me. Over the next several months, when we were tackling something really difficult and I felt like I couldn't look Dr. Franklin in the eye, I would talk to the cactus. That first meeting was a get to know each other session, which I couldn't take too seriously. I don't think a patient is ever supposed to know too much about their psychiatrist, even though I crossed those boundaries pretty quickly. One thing I learned right away was that Dr. Franklin and I would get along, that she was sharp and affable and funny, It wouldn't take me long to realize that she was exactly my type. She must have been in her mid-40s or so, average height, short dark hair, blue eyes. I wouldn't describe her as pretty or beautiful necessarily. Instead, I felt that she was dignified, elegant, and attractive. She asked me a lot of basic questions: my height and weight, my family history, my levels of exercise, what I studied at school, what situations made me feel sad or anxious, when I'd started to question my sexuality. I answered everything as honestly as I could. I decided earlier that first morning that I wouldn't be keeping Angela Damon, my high school teacher, a secret from my therapist. As much as it still hurt, as difficult as it would be to dig up something that still felt so huge and sprawling and terrifying, I knew I would never be able to get away with not mentioning it, and that there would be no point in being a patient at the clinic if I went in with something to hide. I heard myself laying out the facts, my attraction to her, the way she behaved with me, as if I were describing one of my soccer games. It sounded so ordinary when I said it out loud, but even as I spoke the words, I could feel my heart rate picking up because this was supposed to be a secret. This was supposed to be something that I wasn't going to tell anyone. This was supposed to be something I would take to the grave. It became like an addiction, I said quietly. And I think I became addicted to her because she made me feel like I mattered, like I was important. There was a mountain of things I wanted to discuss, and we hadn't even scraped the surface. We didn't even talk about Adele, my most recent infatuation, that first day. I mentioned her, but obviously she was too big a topic to broach in one session right at the beginning. When I was done explaining about Angela Damon, just the basics, not the details, Dr. Franklin looked at me without saying anything. Then she said, "Isn't that a human thing, to want someone to care about you and to make you feel important?" And then, not unkind, but unabashed, unreserved, she asked, "Why are you crying?" It was my first time crying in front of someone for as long as I could remember. I hadn't been a big crier as a little kid, but as I got older, I learned to cry only in private, if I ever did, in my bed, or in an empty room, or in a bathroom stall. "It's okay to be human," she said quietly, as the tears streamed down my face. After that first session, I found the nearest bathroom and cried for another half hour, feeling like there was something enormous and terrifying that had grabbed hold of me a long time ago, and that I was just starting to understand. I hadn't answered Dr. Franklin's question. I thought about it a lot after I finally left the hospital, my next appointment scheduled for a month later, just before the holiday break. What I eventually concluded was that my immediate and overwhelming reaction to what she had said about being human and wanting to be cared about and made to feel important was an enormous fountain of relief, and its source was a dark, starving place deep inside me. Thanks, everyone. And before I hand it off to Vince, I'm going to read a poem that I've been working on for a long time that's called Snails. It's gone through many different iterations. Our silhouettes are holding hands in the petrichor on our third date when we hear a cracking beneath our feet. We crouch down in the dark and see dozens of snails. Snails that have come out onto the sidewalk to breathe after the rain. Snails that are crushed beneath the soles of our Converse and our Doc Martens. We only notice that they're there after we've already begun to step on them. The terrestrial pulmonate gastropod mollusk, also known as the snail, can travel at the incredible speed of 45 meters per hour. A snail's eyes are at the ends of its tentacles. It likes to dine in groups. It takes cover from the scorching heat of the sun for its safety. It comes out in the petrichor, that earthy smell after rain, and it breathes in the oxygen of that scent through its skin. A snail only feeds at night and can retract completely into its shell when it feels threatened. There is reason to believe that snails enjoy having their shells rubbed. I wasn't thinking about snails when I met her in a bar on Bishop Street, small and dark and full of poems. When she asked me to tell her about myself, I told her that I was small and dark and full of poems, that I had squelched through dirty puddles and darkened downtown streets to nibble on spoken word. We rushed and stumbled through our first evening together at the panicked, languid speed of 45 meters per hour. We dined in a group, an anxious, exuberant party of two at the salad bar down the street. The snail's mating process begins with a courting dance, in which snails circle each other for up to 6 hours, touching one another's tentacles and biting one another's lips. Eventually, they press themselves tightly against one another. The next day, she and I ran circles around each other in a cafe and then a bar and then a club for over 6 hours. We touched one another's hands and bit our own lips. We were afraid to leave one another out in the scorching sunlight, to part ways after hours, afraid that this first dance would be the last and only one. Each of us had grown up feeding on horror stories, on convictions of aloneness, on sad poems in the dark. Each of us had been looked at one too many times as though they were the grimy, unexpected mark on the sole of someone's shoe. On the night we find them scattered beneath our feet, we gather every last snail and hide them all in the grass before we uncoil ourselves from the sidewalk. Later, we share a bed for the first time and we turn inward. We retract further into ourselves and away from one another. A snail keeps its shell for life, but even an armor that's so easily broken can be a safeguard for pleasure if it is stroked gently enough. The softest parts of ourselves know the difference between falling open and being torn apart, even by accident. We press ourselves tightly against one another. We put our fingertips in one another's hair, on one another's spines, and we use our hands to see. The next morning, we wake up bare-skinned into the petrichor, and we breathe. Thanks, everyone. It's my pleasure to now pass it on to Vincenzo Pietropaolo. I think you're muted, Vince. Happens to everybody.
Okay. Thank you, Liana, and thank you for reading Snails, because that's actually how I first learned about your work. And it's always such a powerful and moving story. So I'll read two pieces, and I'll read the first piece is from my book, Not Paved with Gold. And it's an excerpt from the introduction that I wrote many years ago. No Paved with Gold is about Italian immigrants in the 1970s in the Toronto area. One of my earliest recollections of my father, the contadino, peasant farmer, now turned construction worker, was of his arrival home at night during the summer months. Haggard, sweaty, and tired, he always entered through the back door that opened into one of those minuscule backyards that are typical of the Victorian semi-detached houses of Toronto's historic Little Italy. He put on his black, dusty lunchbox and removed his hard hat. Then, sitting in a low chair in the kitchen, he proceeded to remove his mud-encrusted work boots. His feet were sweaty and smelly, the source of many an affectionate joke in the family. As he removed his socks, his toes wiggled, as if breathing after a day of being constrained in wool socks and steel-toed boots. His feet, which hardly ever saw the sun, were white, almost bleached, in stark contrast to his deeply sunburned face and arms. The evening light entering from the window at his back engulfed him in a warm glow. My father savored the moment. For me, it was a stunning sight, forever etched in my memory, a photograph that I did not make. Whenever I used to drive with my father through the streets of my adopted city, Toronto, he would inevitably point out certain buildings or sites. He would tell me yet another anecdote about the vast quantities of bricks that he carried around that site, or the overtime they were required to do, pouring cement foundations in the wintry dark days of November. And sometimes he remembered this job site where an accident occurred because of lax or non-existent safety regulations. Through it all, his telling and retelling exuded a quiet pride, not showy and loud, but subtle and sweet, like the taste of Sicilian prickly pears that he would buy for me around Christmas time. I began to realize that my father was not merely a worker, but a builder of my new country, which he helped to build by carrying bricks and by mixing mortar. As I write about him, my mind comfortably wanders back and forth in time, and I recall my own way of relating to the city and the photographic encounters that have spawned many of the images in this book. I remember the time in Roscourt Park near St. Clair when I was photographing a group of men playing bocce, and one of them stopped me and demanded to know why I was taking these pictures. As I sheepishly offered that it was my mother's intention to perhaps one day do a book about immigrants, he declared in a deadpan voice, "Make sure you tell the truth about immigration." And what is the truth? I ventured to ask. His reply was swift and decisive. L'America non è oro, è lavoro. E il santo dollaro non è altro che dolore. America is not gold, it is work. And the sacrosanct dollar is nothing if not pain and suffering. So I'll end that with this note. And in honor of Pride Month, I will read a story from my new book, Toronto's Community, which will be coming out, as Liana mentioned earlier, in May of next year. It contains photographs, of course, but a number of stories, about 40 short stories, which have been written as a way to provide context and maybe a historical outline to the photographs. This is called The Color of Freedom. Everything pointed to an ordinary wedding, but this was not an ordinary occasion. The bride kissed her bride, and history was made in my friend Frank Leuenberg's family when his daughter Tanya married her beloved Gina. For many of the guests, it was our first lesbian wedding. Same-sex marriage had been legalized in Ontario only 3 months earlier, on June 12, 2003, when the Court of Appeal ruled that the definition of marriage as a union between one man and one woman violated the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. Ontario thus became the first jurisdiction in North America to legalize same-sex marriage, but only by the fiat of the court and not through legislation enacted by the Legislative Assembly. This reflected the protracted and continuing struggle of the LGBTQ A2S+ community, not only for recognition of their rights, their human rights in law, but also for societal acceptance in general. The Ontario court's decision was a legal precedent that was followed by a series of similar court decisions in 7 provinces before the federal government finally took action and Parliament passed the Civil Marriage Act in 2005, legalizing same-sex marriage nationwide. But legislative intricacies were set aside on that fine morning in September, as everyone focused on the extraordinarily moving ceremony in which Gina and Tanya deftly combined religion, tradition, and spirituality, while breaking centuries-old barriers. Enoch Turner Schoolhouse, Toronto's first free school, could not have been a more appropriate setting for a lesbian couple whose marriage was about to break age-old taboos. The school was established expressly to provide free education to the poor in 1848, and thus became a catalyst for a free public education system. Another historical taboo broken. The 2 women were married in a traditional Jewish ceremony underneath a chuppah, except that each of the 4 poles was held aloft by a woman, and the officiating rabbi was also a woman. And as the couple took their vows, many hearts in the audience skipped a beat. When they kissed to seal their union, the guests broke out into a spontaneous applause, sustained and thunderous. It was the culmination of a movement, and the guests were humble witnesses to one of the first lesbian marriages on the continent, a continent that was on the cusp of a huge upheaval. Everyone knew that the concept of family would never be the same again, happily. The state-old days of Toronto the Good were numbered. After all, this wedding had also occurred on a Sunday, where much dancing and partying had taken place outdoors. It was not many years before the gay people had been brutally persecuted, both as individuals and as community. In fact, it was frequented by gay men that united them into an organized activist community. One night in February 1981, the police raided 4 gay clubs in a coordinated action, late into the night, and arrested over 300 people. That night will go down in history as a night of infamy. It was the largest mass arrest in Toronto's history up to that point, and most were charged with being in a bawdy house. The event made history as a turning point in the gay liberation movement, which began with an angry demonstration of 3,000 people the next evening in front of police station number 52, and a march at midnight to Queen's Park, the seat of power, that almost turned into a riot. Gay people in Toronto had never before risen up collectively with such strength and anger, and the bathhouse raids were the spark to set off an unstoppable and militant movement. The watershed moment has been called Toronto's version of New York's Stonewall riots. The police had never made similar raids of heterosexual brothels, and their actions raised awareness of the injustices the gay people faced all the time. Prominent citizens like activist June Caldwood, human rights lawyer Alan Borovoy, and the mayor, John Sewell, and many others strongly condemned the police action, which was unprovoked and cannot be justified in any way. Margaret Atwood called it institutionalized contempt. Most people were eventually cleared of the charges, but the damage to their lives was irreversible. Some lost their jobs, others had their careers thwarted. Their families suffered. It would be 35 years before the police chief would formally apologize to the LGBT community at police headquarters, which was now bedecked with rainbow flags for the occasion, reflecting the institutional acceptance of the community into mainstream society by that time. Sorry, I just lost my, apologize. The first Pride Parade in Toronto took place in 1972. And through the 1970s, the attendance was small, fewer than 100 people attending in the first few years. In those days, the annual parade was an occasion for militant protest, and the march was held in different locations. One participant said, "It felt brave to be part of it," unquote, in the still intolerant city, where police took advantage of the occasion to videotape participants. But after the infamous bathhouse raids, Pride Week was established to coincide with the anniversary of the Stonewall riots, and the parade was quickly transformed into a large and mostly celebratory event that included families and dykes with kids, and floats carrying bands, dancers, and other performers. It became a mechanism for unity and inclusion beyond the LGBTQ population. By 1998, Pride was significant enough for one of the most conservative mayors of all time, Mel Lastman, to feel he should participate, urged on by Toronto's openly gay councillor, Kyle Ray. The mayor rolled in a fire truck and gleefully sprayed thousands of onlookers with water from a toy gun. There was no doubt. City Hall had finally come to the queers party. Straight people showed support for their friends and family as mothers and fathers carried signs that said, "My son is gay, and he's still my son." By 2013, Ontario's first woman and openly lesbian premier, Kathleen Wynne, attended. LGBT people had now become part of officialdom at the highest levels of government. Pride grew into one of the largest parades in the world, befitting Toronto's evolution as one of the most important queer capitals. In 2019, just before the pandemic, it was estimated that between 1 and 2 million people attended, including politicians from the Prime Minister down, along with 200 organizations, as activist groups, labor unions and political parties, Amnesty International, as well as banks and large corporations, clamored to be part of it. Irony of ironies. It is not surprising that the organizing body of Pride Toronto now has to deal with the complex diversity of communities within the overall LGBTQ population and faces controversies like treatment of lesbians and transgender people, racism and racialized minorities, Black Lives Matter, politicized groups like Queers Against Israeli Apartheid, not to mention the implications of corporate sponsorship and the inclusion of Toronto police who on some occasions marched in solidarity and in other years were banned from marching in the parade in uniform due to police harassment of racialized minorities. But on that hot, steamy Sunday of June 23rd, 2019, the unity of the spectators was breathtaking. Thousands of beans in a can, and many crowded on rooftops, on the balconies of high-rise condos, and some even perched themselves precariously on construction scaffolds as Church Street became a wave of rainbow colors fluttering in a sea of humanity. But it wasn't just the vibrancy of the rainbow, the huge numbers of people, nor the full range of skin color of countless bodies that moved some to tears. It was the emotional intensity that was palpable all around. As I gazed at people through my camera lens, I sensed something vibrant, profound, intangible. It was like an invisible color, impossible to capture. The evanescent color in people's eyes that comes with a feeling of tranquility from the knowledge that you now have the freedom to choose to be your own person, to express your sexuality without fear of persecution. This is what I saw in people's eyes, especially in young people who weren't even born at the time of the bathhouse raids. If freedom was a color, I would say it was the color of freedom that I saw at the Pride Parade. And it was the same color that I saw at Tanya and Gina's wedding 16 years earlier. And that concludes my reading. Thank you. And I'd like to take a moment to, before our time runs out, to announce a new project that Liana and I are collaborating. And we just received some seed funding from the Mariano Elia Chair just last week. And the project is called Unveiling the Queer Italian-Canadian Experience, which will be a literary and photographic collaboration featuring photography, of course, my work, and the writing of Liana. And the project explores spaces that hold significance for queer Italian Canadians, principally Montreal and Toronto initially, home to Canada's, which are home to Canada's largest communities, of course, Italian communities. And it will be a kind of, it will be an exhibition, but the idea of the project is that it brings together a young queer writer and a straight older photographer, allowing for an intergenerational and cross-gender approach to the subject. We both believe in the social dimension of art, whereby the artist has a responsibility to support the struggles of the discriminated individuals. And one more thing to mention is the fact that many Italian Canadians have found it necessary to deny their queerness to their families and to relegate their Italianità or their Italianness to second place as they struggle with their own sense of identity. And far from being the center of family bliss, we believe that the traditional family dinner table in Italian homes is now becoming the scene of family conflict and struggle as queer members attempt to gain acceptance and inclusivity. So we think that hopefully our project will encourage inclusivity and acceptance all around. So we have a few more minutes for questions, and thank you again for listening.
Thank you, everyone.
Vince, I have a question. Oh, do you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, I can. Yes.
Okay. Yeah. I know you are a photographer, but I also consider you an absolute wonderful writer. So I hope you'll have an opportunity to have some of your literary views in there, or views done in a literary form also inputted into the project. Although, Liana, I'm very impressed with your work too.
I have a question, if I can. Am I speaking to anybody?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Well, this question can be answered by both of you or one of you. I find often when in my own writing, and this question has been posed to me, so I'm going to pose it to you. People are very curious about, when I'm writing fiction, people want to know what I've made up. Rather not what I made up, what is true about my fiction? What's the true source? And the reverse is equally true. When I'm writing nonfiction, people want to know what I made up. It's kind of, so you have this contradiction. People don't believe you're nonfiction because they think, in fact, it's made up, and people often quiz you. And so I'm curious how you respond to that kind of question. And either one of you or both of you can answer that.
I can start that off. I think it's a great question because so many of us draw from our own lives when we write.
Yes, of course.
And so my response to that is to say, well, the writing will speak for itself. And I don't think that it's especially relevant to distinguish, outside of the work, what's real and what's not real, who or what one character or situation or experience was inspired by. And so I can understand that people are curious and people want to pick apart the work and understand exactly where it comes from. And I can, sympathize with and even, celebrate that curiosity, but I also don't have to answer those questions. So I think that those of us who are writers and who might feel pressured to disclose, this is true or this is not true, it's a very individual choice. I think maybe the people who are closest to us probably may have a right to know, but again, those are discussions that you have to have with people. And it makes me think of Elena Ferrante, actually. There was an interesting there's been some interesting, discourse and discussion about Elena Ferrante and her right to privacy and how she fictionalizes herself in her work. And people have no real idea who she is. And there have been numerous, investigative attempts to figure out who she is and where she's from and what's real and what's not real. And what that does is it threatens an individual's privacy and really the integrity of their work. And so whenever we talk about what's true or not in a writing or a fiction context, I keep coming back to Elena Ferrante and how she said that she has the right to fictionalize herself if she so chooses, and to not answer anybody's questions if she doesn't feel comfortable with them. Vince, what do you think?
Well, I think that reality and fiction are sometimes one and the same thing. And I think that also, with the exception of basic information like dates and names, because when you write fiction, I imagine, I'm not a fiction writer, but when you write anything, you write from your own perspective, your own memory. And so what is reality? Even a photograph is a photograph of, a photograph is supposed to be something of reality in front of the camera, but someone chooses to place the camera in a certain way, and somebody else chooses to place the camera in a slightly different way at the same time. So they have two versions of reality. And then how you remember it and how you describe it is, it's not really real. It's been tampered with. So I think it's a question that sometimes you can't tell, but once you describe fiction really, really well, it looks like, reality, it looks like fiction.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely, to me.
Yeah. And then if I could just add, I find my own personal response is often to be even irritated by the question.
Right.
Because I find you're not understanding the writing. I mean, writing has a series, as you point out, Vincenzo, a series of choices, and those choices already don't capture the complexity of reality, right? It's a certain perspective and focus.
Mm-hmm.
That's it. I don't have anything else to add to it.
Thanks, Carmelo. Were there any further questions?
Don't be shy.
Well, I'll ask another one. I'm very curious, Liliana, because I know you write poetry. How is the process different? Prose versus poetry.
I think that fiction is like origami, where you have to fold everything together in a very specific way so that it holds up its shape. And poetry is like a puzzle, where you have all the pieces and they're all there, but you have to put them in exactly the right spot. So both of them are puzzles in different ways. I find that poetry is a lot more imagistic and much more likely to be inspired by a feeling or something that I saw. And I think that poetry is also very much more focused on very specific and small moments in time, whereas fiction is usually something larger. If I see, through my window in the balcony across the way, somebody who's trying to protect a bird on their balcony from their cat, that would be a poem and not fiction, because the moment is so small and singular that it feels like it should be boxed into a poem, and fiction would be something different.
Well, Vincenzo, you're a dual practitioner as well. Do you find photography influences your writing, and does it flow the other way? Does the writing influence your photography?
That's a very interesting question, because I believe that photography and writing are so related, and they're, to write with light. So it's a way of capturing a certain feeling, a moment, a certain description. And when you're writing a paragraph, you might try and do the same thing with with pen and paper. I think that I think the best teacher of photography would be to have a good knowledge of literature. It can be your best teacher. I think that, aside from the technical stuff, which you might call the grammar, cameras and lenses and stuff like that, it's the idea of photographing, the concept of recording certain things in certain ways, which then you give them a kind of an intention. There's an intentionality to it. In my work, the intentionality is usually to do with social issues, social justice. So I photograph in a certain way. or I write in a certain way. So the two are very similar. And I would add cinema to that. Actually, it's also very similar in a way, because cinema is very sequential, and I find writing for me to be very sequential. So one does influence the other, absolutely. That's the short answer.
And then if I could be presumptuous and say that my sense of your work is they feed each other.
Yes, and I was originally going to read from a different book called Invisible No More, which is about people with intellectual disabilities, where I photographed these people across Canada. And I felt the photos weren't strong enough, weren't really acute enough to convey the feelings of those people. And so I decided to combine them with writing. And so in that case, I used literary text based on my experience of meeting all those people. And the book became a book of literature and photography together, because I think sometimes one isn't enough. You have to find the right medium for whatever it is you're saying. Some people say what they have to say with drawing, some say with music, some say with sculpture, etc. Some say with poetry, writing, photography. There's all these art mediums.
Thank you. Thank you, Liana.
Of course, and that combination between literature and photography is obviously what Vince and I are going to be using in our project, the unveiling of the Queer Italian Canadian experience. So that wraps up our event for this evening. We want to thank again the Canada Council for the Arts, the Writers Union of Canada, and Accenti magazine, and we want to thank all of you for coming out this evening and for lending us your eyes and ears and attention. So thank you.
Thank you for making time on such a beautiful summer's day.
Mm-hmm.